Good afternoon. Thank you and welcome to our Fall 2024 Equitable Placement webinar series. On behalf of Chancellor Sonia Christian and also Executive Vice Chancellor Dr. John Hetz, Dr. John Stanskis, our Vice Chancellor and Dean Aaron Larson, as well as our system partners, thank you tremendously for attending today's first webinar, our kickoff webinar in our Fall 2024 webinar series. Today's webinar is featuring the California Community College's Chancellor's Office Education and Support Group in partnership with the RP Group, as well as our highlighted system partners and colleges to take a look at equitable placement and completion AB 1705 students with disabilities. Before we dive in, just want to share a few webinar logistics, sort of our webinar housekeeping logistics, if you will. Today's webinar is closed captioned. To access the closed caption feature, please select the closed caption icon on your Zoom screen, and that'll allow you to read live captions if needed. The webinar will also include a Q&A option. To access the Q&A, please click the question and answer tab to enter your questions for presenters and to read their responses. You will be muted with your camera off during the webinar. Few additional webinar logistics. Today's webinar session will be recorded. The slides and the recording will be available on the Chancellor's Office Equitable Placement and Student Completion website. And the slides are also currently available on the RP Group website as well. As I mentioned, this is the first of a 5-part fall webinar series. Please visit the Equitable Placement and Student Completion website to register for additional webinars, and we will drop links to those in the chat throughout today's webinar presentation. For today's webinar, we're proud to introduce and feature our team of presenters. From the Chancellor's Office, joining us is Dean Mia Keeley. She's the Dean in our Educational Services Division here at the Chancellor's Office, as well as Mia's colleague, Jennifer Tabb. She's the program lead of our Disabled Student Programs and Services. Also joining us today as presenters on the webinar, we have the RP Group featuring Mallory Newell from the Multiple Measures Assessment Project. And from San Diego Mesa College, our featured Spotlight College, Kelly Spoon, a STEM Calculus with Support faculty member at San Diego Mesa College. So please join me in a warm welcome to our featured panelists today. And also, for our webinar agenda. Throughout the webinar, so we'll start with the preparatory pathways and STEM calculus completion for students with disabilities, specifically the implications of the AB 1705 standard. And then we'll also look at in today's webinar, we'll hear from teaching and learning strategies, focusing on STEM students with disabilities.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Tabb. I am the Disabled Student Programs and Services Program Lead at the Chancellor's Office. Disabled Student Programs and Services, or DSPS, assist colleges to provide support services and educational accommodations for qualified students to support their student success and to meet the requirements of federal and state non-discrimination and civil rights laws. The ADA defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities of such individual. Title V states that a student with a disability is a person enrolled at a community college who has a verified disability, which limits one or more major life activities, which results in an educational limitation. So if a student applies for DSPS, their disability must be verified in order for them to receive services and accommodations through DSPS. The DSPS program supports students with disabilities so they can have full and equitable access to the community college experience. These supports include DSPS counseling, disability verification, ASL interpreting, real-time captioning, test proctoring, alternate media, assistive technology, learning disability assessments, referrals to other agencies, and a lot more. Next slide, please. One of the supports available to DSPS students are Educational Assistance Courses, or EACs. Educational Assistance Courses are designated as approved special classes for students with disabilities. These specialized courses have been developed for students with disabilities to help them learn strategies for their learning differences, but these courses are technically open to all students. So in order to be considered an educational assistance course, the class must have a majority, meaning 50% or more, of the students in that class be DSPS students. So for example, EAC courses could be things like e-text basics, learning how to access and effectively use electronic text, or study skills for higher education, critical thinking, math concepts, and so on. AB 1705 makes an exception for students with documented disabilities participating in a college's educational assistance classes who are otherwise unable to benefit from general college classes, even with appropriate academic adjustments, auxiliary aids, and services. So DSPS students can take educational assistance classes along with other courses. EACs are really meant as an academic support for students with disabilities. So taking EAC classes does not stop DSPS students from participating in other classes. With the right services and supports, including things like universal design for learning, DSPS students are just as capable as non-DSPS students in meeting their academic goals. And now I'm going to pass it over to Mallory.
Thank you, Jennifer. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to share with you some new research. And the research is rooted in AB 1705, the standards of AB 1705 and the law. And particularly, we want to focus on the requirement under the law where community colleges are to ensure that STEM students begin math in the course that best positions them to complete their calculus requirement, regardless of their background or their special population status. So if we go to the next slide, the work that I'm going to share with you today, focusing on disabled students, stems from a larger study that we released in February, a statewide study looking at STEM majors across the state within our community college system. And that study is called Preparatory Pathways and STEM Calculus Completion, Implications of the AB 1705 Standards. And when looking system-wide, we found high rates of attrition along the path to calculus for STEM students who began in a preparatory course. And this was the case for students who had completed pre-calculus and calculus in high school, and for those with less math preparation. So both highly prepared and less prepared student groups. So overall, regardless of their high school math preparation, it was found in the report that students who directly enrolled in STEM Calculus 1 were more likely to complete calculus in 2 years than those who started in preparatory coursework. So now we wanted to explore, is this true for DSPS students as well? So we have this new brief, and I'll put the link in the chat for you in a moment. Preparatory Pathways and STEM Calculus Completion for Students with Disabilities, Implications of the AB 1705 Standards. And I'll go ahead and walk you through some of the information in that brief. First, I want to provide some context. So the methodology for the brief pertaining to DSPS students is the same methodology and data file that we use for the statewide analysis. The cohort includes students with a declared STEM major who had an initial math course enrollment in a STEM calculus pathway course. So that includes pre-calculus, trigonometry, and college algebra. And their enrollment took place between 2012 and 2019-20, so 2012-13 and 2019-20. And we tracked them for 2 years to see if they successfully completed Calculus 1 within that 2-year time frame. So give you an idea of the number of students this included, it was a little around 2,000 unique DSPS students and 35,000 non-DSPS students. And if you're interested in more information about the methodology and the number of students included, I'll go ahead and put the link into the chat of the report, and you can explore that there. So the next slide, please. So this first graph that you see here is disaggregating the data by DSPS students and non-DSPS students. And we're looking at completion of STEM Calculus 1 within 2 years, so students who successfully completed Calculus 1, by the first community college math course that a student attempted. And so these are all STEM majors. And we're looking at college algebra, trigonometry, pre-calculus, and STEM Calculus 1. On the left in the blue are their DSPS students, and the right are in the orange are our non-DSPS students. And again, DSPS students are those students who we are able to identify within the Chancellor's Office data information system who were receiving services from a Disabled Students Program and Services office. So what we see here is that DSPS students have similar completion rates as non-DSPS students in STEM Calculus Pathway courses, including in STEM Calculus 1. So for example, when we look at STEM Calculus 1 for students who start directly there, the completion rate in 2 years for DSPS students is 77% compared to 78% for non-DSPS students. So what this emphasizes is that DSPS students are doing as well as non-DSPS students with the services that they are currently receiving and producing very similar outcomes as the general population. But we know that services are not designed to ameliorate attrition through a sequence. And we are seeing that here as well, that we're seeing progressively improvements in completion of STEM Calculus 1, the higher a student begins in a math course. But then we are seeing the highest completion when students are starting directly in STEM Calculus 1. So the next slide, we're going to look at the differences of DSPS and non-DS students based on their high school preparation. So when we look at the top row, the two top boxes on the top row, we're looking at those students in the lowest placement profile, or those students who had the lowest high school preparation. And we're looking at DSPS and non-DSPS students. And again, we're looking at the course in which a student started within the STEM Calculus math pathway. So college algebra, trigonometry, pre-calculus, or STEM Calculus 1. And if we're focusing just on the students in the lowest STEM placement profile, those are students who meet one or both of the following criteria: that they had a GPA less than 2.6 in high school and or have not passed high school pre-calculus or trigonometry. So they have a lower STEM preparation in high school. And what we see here are very similar patterns to what we see system-wide when we disaggregate it by DSPS and non-DSPS students. But we also see that DSPS students have very similar completion of STEM Calculus 1 as non-DSPS students. So if we're looking at the blue bar, and those are students who start directly in STEM Calculus 1, the completion rate of DSPS students with lower high school preparation is 66% compared to non-DSPS students at 67%. So again, we have similar outcomes for our DSPS and non-DSPS students. And then when we look at our higher placement profile, that includes everyone else. So any student with a 2.6 GPA in high school or above who have passed with a C or better pre-calculus or trigonometry. And again, we see similar patterns as we saw system in the statewide analysis. Again, DSPS students have very similar completion rates of STEM Calculus 1. If we're focusing solely on STEM Calculus 1, 80% completion in 2 years for DSPS students and 81% for non-DSPS students. And then again, we're seeing very similar patterns where if a student progressively starts in a higher level math course in the pathway, they have higher completion of STEM Calculus 1, but the highest completion rate is exhibited for students who start directly in STEM Calculus 1. For DSPS and non-DSPS students, and also for students with lower or higher math preparation for STEM. And then just to give you an idea of the cohort here, for DSPS students in the lowest placement profile was a little over 1,000 students, and then just under 1,000 for those in the highest placement profile. And then lastly, we disaggregate the data by the disability categories that are available to us in the Chancellor's Office MIS data system. So if we go to the next slide. Thank you. And what we're again looking at here are the STEM Calculus 1 completion in 2 years. And now we've grouped all of those courses, those prerequisite courses together. So in the red or the ochre bar that's on the left, you're going to see the STEM Calculus prerequisite of pre-calculus, college algebra, and trigonometry combined. And that's going to be compared to any student who starts directly in STEM Calculus 1 with the blue bar. And then we have it by the disability types that are available to us for those who we have a sample size large enough. And we see that across the different types of disabilities, students who started in STEM calculus were more likely to complete calculus in 2 years than students who started in a preparatory course. So for example, if we're looking at those red or ochre bars, we're seeing completion of STEM Calculus 1 within 2 years, ranging from 29% to 36% of students completing within 2 years. And then if we look at the blue bars, we're seeing completion rates ranging from 70% to 96%. So if you would like more details, I'll go ahead and put the report into the chat, and then I'll also go to the Q&A, see if there's any questions that I can answer as we're moving forward, and we'll have time at the end for Q&A. But I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Kelly Spoon, who is a professor at San Diego Mesa College and teaches a calculus with co-requisite course, and she's going to talk about how she supports students with disabilities within her STEM calculus course.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I'm from San Diego Mesa College. I have been teaching our co-requisite calculus course for the last year. So I've done this for 2 semesters now. A little bit about San Diego Mesa College. We are one of the biggest college in our 3-college district. Our headcounts are right now about 20,000. They were at 25,000, but we saw that enrollment dip that most people saw, and we're now kind of on the upswing. We have 14 full-time math faculty, and since I have the opportunity, I'm gonna promote that we are hiring right now. So if you know someone great, let them know. But yeah, we are hiring a math faculty member. Our co-requisite calculus class, it's a 5-unit calculus class linked with a 1-unit trig refresher. We're not technically doing a trig refresher. We're using that 1 unit more as the additional time to support the calculus. And the reason it's a lab, or the reason we've used these lab courses, is they allow us to lessen the amount of units to students. So it's only 6 units to students, while our faculty, it's 8 hours of contact time, and our faculty are getting 8 units. We've had 2 sections every semester since fall of 2023. And for my 2 sections, my success rates were 79.5% and 75.6%. And then the success rates to my colleagues' course were pretty similar. So when Mallory reached out about potentially doing a webinar about working with students with disabilities, I was very excited because accessibility is one of my passions. And this quote really resonates with me. This argument that, like, if we can do something to make things more accessible, we should be doing it. If it makes someone's life extraordinarily better, we should just be doing it as a practice. And so, like, a curb cut is an example of one of those accessibility measures that not only is it a necessity for allowing folks in wheelchairs to be able to move around, but it also opens up the ability for, like, my kid is 5, and like the ability to ride a bike with him and have him on the sidewalk is just such a lovely thing. And so I was thinking about this and how the accommodations might relate to education. And I asked ChatGPT for a quote about how accommodations are just good teaching practices. Like, most of the time when I get an accommodations letter, I'm like, yeah, these all make sense. And it gave me this beautiful quote about integrating reasonable accommodations as part of good teaching is about not overlooking the obvious. What benefits students with disabilities often benefits all students. And it was from this, like, 1997 book that was actually written by math teachers. And I went and found it in the stacks of my library at our school, and turns out it doesn't exist. So it made up this beautiful quote, but it was so nice that I felt I should probably just keep it in. But that's the main crux of this. My entire presentation is, in all of my classes, I've worked really hard so that when a student hands me an accommodation letter, I can just say, like, okay, I think everything should be met already in my class. If there's anything else I can do to support you, or any other way that would help you in this class, just let me know. But let's dive into one of those, what that looks like in an actual accommodation letter. So there are 3 components to this. One is, like I said, trying to make those accommodations that are seen in most of the letters that I get from students, which is part of my course. Ways that I can create better assessments So many of those accommodations are about assessment practices, and trying to level the playing field there. So let's just do better in a way that we are really seeing if a student understands, and then how else can we support all students in our courses. So let's start with the accommodations for all, broadening this access, increasing support, and look at a traditional, a really typical accommodation letter. I just opened every accommodation letter I had received one semester and grabbed one. And then let's look at what are the difference here between instructional accommodations and our testing accommodations. So we have 4 instructional accommodations in this particular letter: recorded lecture, note-taking assistance, alternate text media, and then disability related breaks. So how are these sort of already in my course? One thing, I always post all the class materials early if possible. I'm a very last minute planner, so not always, including completed lecture notes. So that there is like, here's a screenshot from my Canvas shell. This is the day after, like the day of class materials. So I've broken down everything that happened that day in case a student has to miss class. I have given them all the board work and notes are on OneNote. I have given them all of the worksheets along with keys that were given in class. And then I've embedded the slides that we did as a class as well. But this is what they get, right? Any student in my class, when they leave, they can get all the notes that we covered. I use OneNote for Education. So all of my students have access to our class notes, they have access to their own space, and they have access to a collaboration space. But my goal here is partially that I don't need to have a student who works as a note taker, because everything that I say, everything that I write down in class is in OneNote, and all of my students have access to it, regardless of whether they were in class or not, regardless of whether or not they have this accommodation. And then, like I said, everything is available to them ahead of time in an accessible manner. So there's a PDF that's tagged that they have available for anything we're doing in class. And then in terms of a recorded lecture, I actually give my students what I think is better. Typically, I think if you record a lecture, there's a bunch of other side chatter. There's, it might be good in terms of hearing the student questions, but typically what I'll do instead is I'll record a second video for all of our topics, a second set of videos where I am working through different examples. So that way, if you were in class and what we did in class didn't resonate with you, you're able to go to Canvas and watch a different video, another example, and maybe that example is when it clicks. But this way, students are getting both the recordings that are made intentionally to be recordings. So they are structured in a way that makes sense. They're at a length that students would want to watch. And I'm able to use the appropriate technology. And then they also have the lecture in class if they want that. And then this idea, all of this, if you look back at this previous screen, you can't see it, but in addition to the video, I will write out everything in terms of like a written explanation and a video explanation. And then I'll typically work in some like formative assessments using H5P. That's in the weeds, but I really want this idea of universal design for learning, where students have multiple ways to interact with the material, whichever might work best for them. So that they have a way to engage. And that is another key feature of working with this population of students and making sure that our courses are accessible to them. So giving students these different formats in which they can learn the material. So we have stuff that we did in class, we have everything online, there's text, there's video, and there's a number of different ways that they can use formative assessment to see where their level of understanding is. So to summarize those instructional accommodations, I post all of those class materials, including completed lecture notes, so that way students who need note-taking, students who need to take a break, they still have everything that they might have missed. I post learning materials in multiple modalities so that students can engage with them outside of class. And then for any of the material I provide, I always provide guidance on how to engage with those materials. So I provide a course tour showing students where that is. I walk students through the materials on Canvas multiple times during the semester when they might be useful. And even as I'm doing a video for students, I'm telling students, okay, now pause the video, try this on your own, see how you would do. So I'm really trying to make sure that they understand how to be a math learner in our classroom. And then moving on to testing accommodations. Testing accommodations usually involve extended time, sometimes, distraction, reduced setting. And so for some of those, for those things, what I do, I tend to try to make an exam. It's a lot of word on the page, but it says, I've written an exam that should only take 90 minutes for a well-prepared student. My class happens to meet for 3 hours. I know that that's a luxury on Fridays. And so I've already got the 2 times accommodation just built into the class. Now I realize I would need to give a student 2 times that if they want. And I would still let them take it through DSPS and have that additional time. That's perfectly fine with me. But I then also give my students an extra hour on the front and back end of that time. So I'm sitting in my classroom for 5 hours typically that they can have to take this exam. And for me, this is more of a, hey, if you want to take it in the morning, if that's when you're your best, come take it in the morning. If you want to take it in the afternoon, if you need extra time. For me, it's about, do you understand the math? Not, can you do the math in a certain amount of time? So and again, I'm in a very lucky situation where I have a 3-hour class and I have an open classroom because I'm on Friday when no other math classes really meet. So I'm able to open up my classroom for that extended amount of time to let my students take that exam. In terms of like distraction reduced, I will tell students it can be distracting to be in the classroom. If they want to take the test in the classroom, there are advantages, like I will answer questions. But if they need to have distraction reduced, they could always wear headphones, or we can face a table away. Or again, they're welcome to take this through our proctoring center with DSPS, but I'm just trying to make it so pretty much every student has this ability to have extra time if they need it. So within those testing accommodations, I have made a really conscious effort for me, because I always love every question, to write shorter exams. So many times this is involved moving those skills and questions that I want to put on my exam and moving those into weekly quizzes instead. So I'm doing a lot of assessment, separating skills whenever possible. And I'll show an example of what that looks like in a second. But I think students get overwhelmed, and a lot of test anxiety comes when they see a blank page and they're not sure how to progress. And so I really try to break down the separate skills. It also helps me with grading. And then to provide a formula sheet, because we do have one counselor at our school who really likes memory aids. And so I think it's a separate skill. Can you memorize all of the basic derivatives and derivative rules versus can you apply all of these things in problems? And so my test is 2 parts. The first part is them filling out those basic derivatives that we really want them to know before they head to Calc 2. And then once they hand that to me, I give them a formula sheet with all of that already entered and let them have their test. So I am assessing both, but they're kind of separate. And in fact, I count the memorized derivative rules as a quiz. And then the test is just, can you apply those derivative rules? So when I talk about breaking up skills, I know this is a Calc 2 example, but it was just on my mind as I was reconsidering what Calc 2 looked like over the summer. Partial fraction decomposition has a number of different skills that are involved. First, students need to know what the appropriate partial fraction decomposition looks like. They need to know the algebra of actually finding that A, B, C, and then they need to be able to integrate the result. And so you can see in this question, I was working on the first and that last skill, like what does the format look like? What is the general answer? And I have a couple of questions where they also have to do the factoring. And then the algebra of finding the A, the B, all those coefficients, I did put into a different question where I actually gave them the answer because I wanted to see that they knew that as well. But I was worried if they didn't have this part down, they couldn't, if they had written the wrong decomposition, then they were potentially making a problem impossible, much easier. And it becomes a really hard thing to assess how many points is that worth, or what does that show in terms of their understanding. So by breaking it into these different pieces, I made it more accessible for the students and less chance that they got overwhelmed, but at the same time made my life a lot easier when it came to evaluating how many points that would be worth. So that was about reconsidering those traditional exams. I think in general, we could do better than exams, right? Testing accommodations are all focused on exams, but in general, we should be grading for understanding. So in my slides, you can look later, I have my link to my current syllabus. My grades are based on these 4 different pieces: exams, portfolios, quizzes, and take-home quizzes. And the portfolio and take-home quizzes, students can get help. They can work with a tutor, they can check their answers with someone else. But those are a small portion of their grade. And then 70% of their grade comes in the form of exams and quizzes. So I'm really trying to make sure that what they can do independently is what they are mostly being graded on. A key component, though, is that I'm grading them on that understanding and not when it happened, which I think is crucial, both for everyone in a supported class, right? When we don't have that same incoming prerequisite skill base, but also with this population of students that might have different disabilities. And so for all those sections, my students can reassess, right? They can retake quizzes, they can retake an exam, they can correct their take-home quizzes after getting feedback. And so there is this it's about, can you get there, not when do you get there? So if it takes a student a little bit more time, whether it's because their lack of incoming skills or something else, that's not going to be an issue in terms of negatively impacting their grade. And then the last piece is about grading for the understanding. So everything here is graded for understanding. I don't hold students to a hard deadline on anything. And that is, again, one of those things that's in most accommodation letters is that, oh, this student can email you ahead of time and get a 48-hour extension. And in my class, it's like everybody has a 48-hour extension. If life happens or you need more time, take it. As long as you turn it in and show me you understand this, we're fine. So a lot of these ideas come from Joe Feldman's book, Grading for Equity. It can be a rough read as a math instructor when he talks about how we don't understand how any of the numbers work. But he does have these 2 lovely ideas that I've tried to really weave into my class in every way possible. And that is the purpose of assessment, right? We have this dichotomy of formative assessment is assessment to help you learn and figure out where your understanding is and what you need to work on. And summative assessment is just evaluative at the end. And I love the idea of assessments being formative until they show that you understand the materials. So why separate these things, and why not just have all assessment be formative until you can show that you are able to do whatever that skill is. And I think this is also important because students tend to not look at feedback, right? Once they're given points on it. And when they know they can reassess, they're much more likely to try to figure out what they did wrong and figure out exactly where they could improve. And so to give you an example of what this looks like in my class, this is a quiz question along with some student work. And there's a little cutoff video of me explaining what was beautiful about this student's work. So about continuity. So I asked them to determine the value of B to make a function continuous at a particular value of X, and then to explain their reasoning. And the really, really magical thing about reassessment is that I could hold students to an incredibly high standard. So in this case, if this student in fact, I think only 2 students got full points for this because a lot of students were missing something. They didn't explain the left and the right side limit and what those values were. They didn't mention the function's actual value at 2 somewhere along the lines, or they made an algebraic mistake in the work off to the right. And so there were a lot of places that students could still improve and got feedback and work towards making this stronger. And then of course, when they reassess this in the next quiz, I would never ask them the exact same question. So I did, I have a bank of different types of questions that have the same idea. So in this case, we're still talking about using reasoning with limits and continuity, but now they had to classify the type of discontinuity that was present. So these particular 2 examples are from the TBIL calculus question bank, which is amazing. But this really lets students know they can't just memorize and mimic for the second attempt at something. They really have to understand that material. And part of that, like reassessment, allows them to figure out what different strategies work between the reassessments, right? If they reassess and they do just as they don't do any better, well, what did you do? And I usually have them fill out a questionnaire before they can take a quiz again, saying what they did to study. So then I can kind of intervene and be like, well, maybe there was a better choice. Getting back to that whole idea of UDL, students can show understanding in ways other than exams and quizzes. I recognize that I do want my students to be able to be successful in the next class. So they really do need to be able to take exams and quizzes, right? Like that is how most courses are traditionally assessed. But occasionally I'll use alternative assessments, especially if it's a skill that I don't think is going to like make or break their understanding in Calc 2. So just letting students highlight and choose a way to show their understanding can be really helpful for a lot of student groups in terms of feeling like their understanding is valued and it's not just all tests. So I have an example here from a portfolio on limits that my students can choose 4 different options to show me their understanding of limits. And then again, for any group, and I think this is also a lesson learned for me, having my students, having done this for now a year, and knowing how my students did moving from my supported calculus class into a lecture-based Calc 2, I realized what was really helpful for them, and it was the amount of scaffolding I gave them in terms of assessment. So they weren't just taking an exam and it was their first time, which is what happened in their Calc 2. They had a lecture-based instructors, and for the most part, the only assessment that they were seeing, the only time they were getting feedback was exams. But in my class, they're getting feedback and assessing their understanding during board work. When we do our lecture, I give them a worksheet that they can take with them if they want, and I post that key. And then also in the assessment structure, they're doing a take-home quiz where they have a little bit of support, right? They're doing an in-class quiz where they don't have any support, but they don't have to do as much. And then they have an exam. So I'm really just like taking away the little bits of support and seeing how they do, and helping them be successful in that exam. So I will say one thing is I would like to make this a little more obvious to students so that when they move into Calc 2, they're they have that framework available to them, because I think sometimes they don't recognize that the scaffolding is happening, and how to recreate it for themselves. Another thing that this is like a horrible segue between slides, but forgive me. I listened to a podcast last week, the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, and it was about alt grading, but I think it was Josh Eiler. They mentioned this quote from this book, Bird by Bird. And the woman was talking about how her little brother was sitting at the kitchen table, overwhelmed because he had put off this project that he had 3 months to do about birds, and had a bunch of books around him. And he was like, I don't even know what to do. And his dad came over and was like, you got it. Just take it bird by bird. And so it was this idea of making things manageable by breaking them down into smaller steps or smaller bits. And I realized as I was listening to this podcast that there's this big shift. And I think this is necessary working with students in this post AB 1705 landscape, is keeping our students as critical thinkers while not like just giving them the easy way out. So to me, I used to provide steps, right? It's how textbooks are written, like, oh, you want to do this, here are the steps. And it's really nice because students can follow the procedure and get an answer, but they are not flexible problem solvers. They can't handle something that doesn't look exactly like what they just saw. And so I really want students to still have something that they can kind of look to as guidance. And so I moved from providing steps to highlighting skills. And I think this is, again, working towards self-efficacy. So if we're talking about the chain rule, there are a bunch of skills that you might need to work on here, right? You might need to recognize the composition of 2 functions. You might need to know how to decompose that. You might need to know how to apply the chain rule. Like maybe you can actually recognize it, but you just don't have that chain rule mechanics down. Or perhaps what you're working on is just the communication. My students love to think parentheses don't matter, or that they have no real meaning. So maybe you need to work on that. But by breaking it down, I can then help a student recognize, okay, which of the parts is this breaking down at? What do you need to work on? And then the last thing is like other ways that we can support our students. Going back to that paper that said UDL is sort of the playing field leveler for students with disability in STEM fields, right? And it helps all students. When I think of UDL, it's not just all the content on Canvas. It's not just the different types of assessment. It's recognizing that in general, there's this sort of dichotomy that is, I think, a false one between lecture-based instructors and active learning instructors. Because you talk to my colleagues who you walk past their classroom and they lecture for those 3 hours. And they'll tell you it's really important that students practice. They really need to practice this material. They need to explain it to somebody else. They need to connect this to the other stuff they're doing. And then you go and you to the active classrooms and they're like, oh yeah, well, they need to watch my videos. I put them all in on Canvas. They're in Play Posit so I can see that they watched them. I do this check-in quiz. And in reality, the active learning instructors are all saying that it's important to learn from an expert. Students need to watch my video. And the lecture-based instructors saying it's important for students to try things on their own and like figure out their own mistakes and make those connections and explain. And so we both believe these things to be true. And I think that the important thing is we do both. And so to me, the thinking classrooms approach is a way in which you can do both and give that little bit of UDL to your actual classroom. I think the UDL to me in a classroom is let students practice and play with problems, but also spend some time lecturing and explaining to them. Don't put it on them outside of class. Then they can't ask you the questions. Do that in class. Make time. It doesn't have to be a whole bunch, but like do an example or two in class. Explain something in class for them as well. I think it's a both and. So if you haven't read this book, strongly recommend. Again, my goal in my class is to really create students who are reasoners, who are not just following steps. I dropped publisher like homework a long time ago because students would just to look at the how to solve this and they would just copy the same steps with new numbers. And so figuring out ways to get students into that space of reasoning has really been like my driving motivation ever since. And then I always have to highlight these 2 keys and these beautiful sketch notes that for my class, I always, we do a bunch of problems at the boards. And when I say boards, this is just around the room. We don't have whiteboards around the room, but I do have these white books around the room. And students work together and they can focus on whatever they want to focus on and they can learn from each other. And in this setting, it really allows the work to be something where every student can engage. Because even if they're not the student with the pen, even if they're a little bit lost in terms of what's happening, they can look around at the other boards and notice similarities and differences, see if they understand a step a group has taken. There's definitely a place to engage for every student within the Building Thinking Classrooms framework. And the visibly random groups, we're going to talk about this in a second. This is another key component. My students, they get new groups of 3 every single day. This allows my students to learn how to work with a bunch of different people. It also makes sure those prerequisite knowledge gaps are sort of dispersed throughout the room in terms of like, oh, maybe factoring is not your strong suit, but hopefully somebody in that 3 knows how to factor or at least use their calculator to help find the factored form of something. I do want to mention though that there's a lot of work, beautiful work. Sarah Silverman does a lot of work in this space. There was just a great podcast about this too, about neurodiverse students and the idea of group work, because there's a lot usually pushback of like, oh, well, what about my students who might be on the spectrum, or how are they going to work in this space? And there's these 2 sort of issues that Sarah Silverman brings up in her talk. There's these talk intensive group activities where marginalized students might feel like they're not being heard or feel less valued. And then there's these chaotic spaces where we have these social spaces that can be really difficult for some of our students who are disabled to navigate. And I do think these are still important places, even more so for these groups, for talk intensive group activities, for those marginalized students who may not be feeling like they are being valued in their group. As an instructor, an instructional move is to walk around the room and highlight the contributions from those students who might be seen as lower status. So I will intentionally walk around the room and be like, oh, you know what, that's an amazing idea. Let me share that. Can I share it with the class? And I will just share that out really quick to sort of raise their status within the group. But again, when you're doing the random groups, you don't see this being an issue. And I don't even see this with my students. I think today's students are really like an empathetic and amazing group of individuals that this isn't as much of an issue. And then for the high stakes nature of the social aspect, to me, it's about lessening those stakes, co-creating norms, making sure they're not being graded on that group work. So they don't have to worry about like, well, what if right? It's not, there's no grade to it. It's a random group. So like, the social stakes are low. You only have to work with them for today, and then next week you get someone else. And so I think, and then again, these are not situations that I really see in my own classroom doing this work. My students are amazing in terms of lifting each other up, and I think that's just because of the community we built as a class. I do want to point out that like you get a lot of pushback when you talk about this approach from faculty of like, well, what if a student doesn't want to engage? First, I do a lot of work to explain why it's important. And then I allow students to choose how. So you can actually see in this picture, this student here sitting off to the side doing his own work. And I didn't question it. Usually he was at the boards. I don't know what was happening that day. Maybe he didn't feel as confident. I don't know. But I just sort of let that happen. I'm not pushy. If a student needs a break and wants to sit down, they can take a break and sit down. It is entirely up to them. I trust them to make their own decisions. And that's all I have. So there's a lot of Q&A. How do you suggest we encourage our faculty to follow these practices? It does take a lot of time and work. In fact, I'm at UCSD because I was just doing a talk and someone was like, let me tell you, this takes a lot of time. Like you are not putting that in your presentation. This takes a ton of time. And I think part of it is realizing it's not going to be perfect. It's iterative, right? Like a lot of the pieces of my course were not there in the first time. I just took notes about like what was working, what wasn't working. Like, oh my God, they didn't know how to do this. And I really should have spent some time to scaffold that part in or do a review. So focusing on the like, it's okay, we're doing it bit by bit. I also think it's helpful if you can create a community practice and fund folks, right? A lot of faculty, a lot of schools got AB 1705 money. When we had our AB 705 money, we had community practice for every course that we made a co-rec for. And we would meet weekly. We were all compensated for meeting. And we had like a standing agenda that was just like, okay, let's talk about our struggles. Let's try to help people who are having struggles. Let's like maybe try out an activity before we all try it in class, or come up with a couple of activities we could try. So we had a number of things that we did, and we rotated who facilitated those meetings. But I think that having that support crew to go through that with was lovely. I don't think all faculty will follow these practices. I mean, it's part of the nature of the beast of academic freedom and whatnot. But I do think there are students who the nature of the active classroom sometimes is overwhelming for some students. So I don't think it's bad to have different options for students to go into in terms of classes. I just think that we need to schedule mindfully so that students do have options. I know at my campus, it's a bit of a challenge because we typically have pretty active or interactive Calc 1, and then our Calc 2 is very lecture based. So there's sort of this big drop that happens in terms of support between those two courses. What kind of support are you getting to offer retakes, such as writing different forms, administering? I am not getting any support. I will say, writing them, there are a bunch of great programs. I think I wrote about this in my blog for CAP related to grading. Places to get those reassessments. Obviously, if you had that community of practice, you could work to make those too. Administering retakes, my class, 2.5 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours. I just use that last 30 minutes on the Friday for my retakes. So every day is structured the same, except for that Friday. And then grading them, it doesn't take that much time if you grade in more of a standards-based system. So when I was grading these before, I kept everything on a 0, 1, or 2 scale. Like you did it, it's perfect, you get the points. It could, or one was it could use work. There's something wrong, you could improve. And then 0 was there's no understanding at all being shown. And that made like the grading was incredibly simple. I've added more granularity for better or worse this semester. And they're taking a little bit more time to grade because I now have a 4 level similar to the AP of like, I can't remember. Oh, complete, substantial, developing, or minimal. And so that is a little bit more, but I think if you can just throw your things into buckets, you're not spending so much time figuring out how many points each thing is worth. And then I do have cutoff dates on when those retakes end, so they're not going on all semester. But it's not it doesn't take as much time as you would think. It's surprising. So this question says, is there any information about how the professors who teach pre-calculus and if they also utilize UDL in their course? If not, then how much of that is a contributing factor to low performance? That's a great question. I don't think if any of our pre-calculus instructors use many of these techniques. And our pre-calculus curriculum is pretty outdated in terms of what we cover. I will tell people about it and they will be shocked. So that might contribute to that low performance in that particular class. But I also, our pre-calculus course is beefy. It's got our entire trig course shoved into it. So I think there's curriculum issues with our pre-calculus course that sort of make that a secondary issue. Ooh. Dorothy, I will send you all the things about portfolios if you want to send it to me. Portfolios are just, I give students options for how to show their understanding. So for limits, they can do a 2 truths and a lie. They have them, I give them graphs and they can make one about, they have to make one that's about limits, one that's about function notation, and one that's about continuity, set of 3 truths and a lie. And they have to have 2 truths and a lie, and they have to explain why the lie is actually convincing, which usually highlights their misunderstanding that they originally had on that topic and is really nice. They can also design a slow reveal graphs because we do an activity, so I let them create an activity like that. And again, I put parameters on it, like you can make this, but you need to have a one-sided limit. Or I think I have the different types of discontinuity. I'm like, you need to describe an infinite discontinuity, a jump discontinuity, and a removable discontinuity, as well as end behavior with those limits as you make it. So there's 2 other ones. So they have a lot of different ways that they can show their understanding. They really have to get the limits piece of it. I hope that helped. But yeah, I'm perfectly happy to share anything. I think my entire Canvas course is up on Canvas Commons if you just search my name. The BTC books mention thin slicing and flow. I'm going to admit I haven't actually read the books. I just look at I've read some of them, bits and pieces. But thin slicing and flow. Do you have sets of thin slicing problems? I mean, I have my sets of slides. I won't say that they're beautiful or perfect. Again, they're all in my Canvas shelf. It's on Commons if you want to grab it. I usually grabbed those from like existing worksheets. There's always this, there's existing worksheets that usually have a nice little gradual increase in terms of difficulty. So I use those for my thin slicing. There's a lot of folks in the AP calculus world who share beautiful curriculum. So hats off to Brian Passwater and Tony Record for their gorgeous work that I've pilfered and used everywhere. But have I found to be difficult to keep the flow and create thin slicing sets when there's such a large variability of skills? I haven't. The flow, I mean, my students know that typically I'll warn them ahead of time, like, okay, this is going to be different. Like we're going to increase the spicy level. Let's go. Or like, okay, we're going to switch gears now. And we might have to have a quick little talk about what skill they might need if it's an algebra skill that I know that they're going to be struggling with. But I typically know where we're going to hit those hurdles, and I can either preempt it with a little baby like, hey, maybe we need to know about this, or I'll just let them sort of struggle. And if I see the one group make the breakthrough, I'll be like, oh, look at what the Jacks are doing. And I'll sort of point that out. It is surprisingly have not had any trouble with the variable skills. I think that the randomized groups have just worked out really beautifully. Every once in a while I have to go like work individually with a group, but it's pretty rare.
How does the 8 units for teaching the class work?
Our union got parity for those units a long time ago. I don't know. I'm not in charge of anything, but that was from science faculty. They were basically not being paid the same amount of time that they were working for lab classes. And so they managed to work through a union and get those paid out the same. And so we're just riding on the coattails of those science faculty in these support courses.
Nice. Very cool. And then what's your normal class size?
40, oh, normally it's 46. That's the normal. For our support courses, it's 36. So I started this semester with 42 because I took my wait list. So it's more than I wanted, but I don't like turning them away. I also have open deadlines. However, it's very time intensive. Any tips? Put in some stops, right? Like if you have a big summative assessment, like your exam, like I have my exam on differentiation techniques, my students, there will be no retakes for those quizzes before that exam. So putting in those sort of arbitrary stops, it's not only for me so that I don't have to grade those things indefinitely, but it's also for students to have a real understanding of whether or not they're going to be able to get this. Because students will sometimes be like, it's fine, I'll figure it out. And it's like week 14. And I'm like, you can't do all of calculus in 2 weeks. It's for both of us. So that has helped a lot. And then I don't offer them at all times. Like I'm not going to grade everything all the time. Even with our take-home quizzes, I gave everybody who turned it in on time feedback. And then everybody else, there's going to be a stop deadline. I'm not grading them until that stop deadline comes in, and I'll grade them a second time because those are the most intensive thing to grade. How long is the gap between the deadline for retakes and the first take? So for quizzes, it's every week they can retake quizzes. So week 1, they could retake it in week 2, in week 3, and week 4. Week 4 is when I close limits. So every week. And then the exams, I only let them retake at the end of the semester, the final exam date. So there's a big gap, but at the same time, at the end of the semester, they still need to know all the differentiation techniques heading into Calc 2, and they still need to know all the integration techniques heading into Calc 2. So I feel like it's still a good opportunity for them to retake them then. And they haven't lost any of those skills, hopefully.
Thank you to everyone for being here, and a huge thank you to Kelly. You're always amazing, always great to see you and learn from you. So thank you so much.